Funding elections is a perennial concern and fight, but the fact remains that if Americans expect a secure, convenient election, it requires appropriate investment. Since 2018, we have seen more than $800 million in election security grants and $400 million in CARES Act grants come from the federal government. This cycle also saw more than $400 million in private philanthropy for election administration, and these private dollars were vital to the successful election. We shouldn't count on them in perpetuity. We need a new funding structure. Adam Ambrosi is the director of the Elections and Voting Program at the Democracy Fund. He's a friend and a long ago colleague, and someone who I know has thought as much about election funding as I have. Thank you for being here, Adam, and the panel is yours.
Thanks so much, Matt. I really appreciate it. And thanks to BPC for putting this on. We have a great panel today to really think about what are the past, present, and future of election funding. I'd like to quickly introduce our wonderful panel, frame up the stage a little bit, and then really get into it with them. First of all, we obviously have our wonderful Secretary of State of Arizona, Katie Hobbs. Since 2019, she has served in that role after serving in the Arizona House of Representatives and the Arizona Senate as minority leader. Next, we have EAC Commissioner Ben Hovland, who is now serving as chair of the Election Assistance Commission. He's previously worked in the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration and served as Deputy General Counsel to the Missouri Secretary of State. We also have Clerk Janice Winfrey, who is the city clerk of Detroit, Michigan. She served in this role since 2005 and has implemented a variety of different innovative and important election reforms in the city. We've also going to be hearing from Commissioner Michael Pipe, who serves as the Commissioner of Center County, Pennsylvania. Commissioner Pipe has served on the Board of Commissioners since 2012 and has been chair of the board since 2016. And last but certainly not least, Tiana Epps Johnson, who's the founder and executive director of the Center for Tech and Civic Life. She's led a team that does amazing work at connecting local election officials with the innovation and tools to help them do their jobs better. Recipient of the Skoll Entrepreneurship Award and has done many great things. So today here, we're about to talk about election funding. This is something that's clearly a focus for election officials every year, and this year we saw a new twist to an old problem. From my perspective, we have some real challenging that fuels the election funding crisis year after year. Elections are, of course, carried out at the local level, but the locals have to carry out these elections under state law, national laws, and some standards. The locals have to pay for almost all of the costs, but the greatest pressures that are facing these local election officials occur when you have a presidential election or a statewide election. So that fuels a lot of the pressure connected to major elections. Furthermore, whenever there's a major event, a change in how elections have to be conducted, that causes ripple effects, downstream impacts, and funding needs for election officials across the way. So over the last decade, we've seen major themes emerge that impact funding crises over the last few presidential cycles that require different attention and focus from election officials at the local, state, and federal level. After 2012, there were major questions and concerns related to long lines after the election that led to the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration. After 2016, we saw initial concerns of foreign interference led to a huge amount of activity and work at the federal, state, and local level in trying to identify and rebuff those concerns. In 2018 and 2019, there was federal funding, as Matt indicated, to provide some support to state election offices to answer those cybersecurity threats, $380 million in 2018 and $425 million in 2019. In 2020, we saw COVID hit, quite frankly. Congress responded for $400 million in CARES Act funding directly to the states to help respond to run an election during a global pandemic. There was some acknowledgement that that was not nearly enough, and some acknowledgement from Congress that more might be needed later. Sadly, more did not come later from the federal government. And so this conversation that we have today with folks at the state, the federal level, large and small local jurisdictions, as well as civil society, is really important And of course, I'd love to turn it over to Secretary Hobbs first to really find out what you were thinking when you first started to see the threat of the pandemic and how you thought that might impact how to run elections in Arizona, how you would work with your state to really figure out the needs and fill those needs.
That is the statement of 2020. Am I muted? We had our presidential preference election mid-March. So it was really when the pandemic was starting to hit Arizona. We had our first few identified cases the week before. And so we really pulled together the resources to make sure that election could happen. And the election went extremely smoothly. But it was because we had worked in partnership with election officials across the state prior to the pandemic to make sure that we were preparing for the election, regardless of knowing that we were going to be in a pandemic. And it really was, I think, rather fortunate because it helped us in terms of planning and preparation for the August primary that we had, and then the November election, and really helped us make that wish list of all the things that we need to make sure that voters can vote safely, that election staff stay safe, and that we can have an election knowing that there would be a historic voter participation.
Thank you. I'd love to see how Chairman Hovland thinks about the federal role, both in this from February to March and April timeframe, as well as how the EAC thought about getting the CARES Act money out to states as quickly as they possibly could.
Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here. Thanks for BPC for hosting this. Obviously, you just can't give enough credit to the state and local administrators who ran elections this year. I think at the federal level, we were able to provide support. We were able to pull together resources, certainly things like the critical infrastructure designation and the governance structure that created. We had a government coordinating council and sector coordinating council working group on COVID resources that produced a number of resources. The CARES Act money that you mentioned, Congress gave us 30 days to distribute that. At the EAC, we were able to do that. That was obviously an important piece. As people have mentioned or you've heard, there were some parameters attached to that, a 20% match, some reporting requirements that the states weren't huge fans of. But again, I think it was important, and I think it was important to get that money out early. One of the things that I see when I look at 2020, the difference between the primaries and the general in many ways, or the primaries in some states, was the lack of time to plan and prepare. And having that CARES Act money, having it early, having some of the other guidance, hearing from states, again, you've got to give a lot of credit to election officials in Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah. Of course, Arizona has it was 75% mail balloting before this year, being able to share some of those best practices across the country. And election officials were able to make some decisions about what kind of purchasing or procurement they needed to do to prepare for the general, knowing that those timelines were in the spring and early summer. And so, again, I think a lot of things went into it to make this year run as smoothly as it did. Most of that is the hard work of state and local election administrators, but certainly we were happy at EAC to do whatever we could and distribute that CARES Act money as quickly as we were able to.
Great, thank you. As we know, elections really are run by local government, and we're lucky to be joined by Clerk Winfrey and Commissioner Pipe, representing very different size jurisdictions, very different interests in voters, very different ways that the pandemic impacted both of those communities in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. I'd love to hear how you all thought about the impacts of this, especially in the early days when we weren't exactly sure how bad the impact of it was going to be, and how you worked to plan running an election during a global pandemic?
Well, you didn't call a name, so I'm just going to jump in. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of this important discussion. But in Detroit, as many of you know, we were a hotspot, and the pandemic hit us especially hard. Me and my husband had COVID-19. So, but through it all, we did this. We planned. We were at a stay-at-home order, and I think that order was issued to us in like March, and we weren't able to return to the office until June the 1st. Well, elections was able to. So during that time, we met daily and we planned. We knew that our poll workers weren't the ones that we usually use, weren't available to us. Many of them didn't make it through. And those that did didn't want to participate in the process. So we had to recruit an entirely new set of poll workers. And we did that mostly through the sororities and the fraternities. Vice President Harris is a Alpha Kappa Alpha, member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. I'm an active member of Alpha Kappa Alpha. And we use that. We use those sorority sisters, the fraternities, all of the Divine Nine, all of the Black fraternities and sororities. We have a group called Divine Nine, and I reached out to them, and they rose to the occasion. They stepped in. They brought their children, their adult children, to work with us, and it really, really mattered. That, of course, and the grant that allowed us to pay for the help that we received from the sororities and the fraternities and other state and local government entities staff.
Great. Commissioner Pipe?
Sure, thank you so much. And I similar experience here in Center County, where as the pandemic increased and we saw more cases in the community, we had more concern from our elderly poll workers about being in a room for 13, 14 hours a day, interacting with members of the community. So we likewise had to recruit individuals, and being able to provide some bonus pay or hazard pay to make sure that they came and stayed for the full day was so important. But I think as we experience in Center County, we're a university town. And so we actually had about 30,000 to 35,000 of our Penn State students not return to campus. And so that allowed us a better management of the pandemic here in Center County, where we didn't see as many cases until the students came back for the fall semester in August. But I will say that without a doubt, the ability for us to have 5 extra weeks to plan for the primary election, where the Commonwealth gave us those 5 additional weeks with extending the primary, was terrific. We could not have done a primary election in the midst of a pandemic in April, and instead delaying it to June allowed us to prepare, get the necessary PPE, make sure that PPE went to the frontline workers, the healthcare workers, and we were able to then procure things as we approached the June election. But so much credit needs to go to the poll workers that made this happen. And again, the grant that we were able to get as well from the Ctcl allowed us to compensate them and encourage them and thank them for their hard work.
Thank you. And that's a great segue and thanks for teeing that up for me to turn to Tiana. As we know, Ctcl received a large grant from a very, very wealthy internet titan. And there's been a lot of questions or concerns about this, as well as a lot of excitement as far as what those grant dollars could do. For those folks that haven't heard from you before, could you explain the process you went through to both identify who needed grants, who got grants, where they were, and what you're thinking about them now as private philanthropy funding assistance for local government in the time of a pandemic?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think the first place to start is that prior to March at Ctcl, our focus was helping our country's local election officials have the tools, the skills that they need to run excellent elections year round. So we weren't in the business of grant making. It wasn't until around early spring we started hearing from election officials, really of every size, every type, that their number one need and concern was funding. And, for us, we were delivering tools and training, but we were hearing, if you're dealing with 2 times or 10 times your typical volume of mail ballots and the applications for those ballots and the calls from voters about those ballots, for instance, you're going to need more staff and more equipment. And we were concerned that, the 10% of the nearly $4 billion that was estimated that was needed and allocated ultimately by Congress wasn't going to be enough, and that there may not be more funding to come. And so it's from that concern that we launched a national COVID-19 response grant program for local election officials. And here's how it worked. We invited every local election official in the country that had a role in administering the November election to apply for a grant. We guaranteed that every election office that was verified as legitimate would receive a grant. It was really important to us that even the smallest election departments received meaningful grant funds that they could put to work for their voters. So we made a minimum grant amount of at least $5,000 to any grantee. And at the core, the program is really focused on keeping election departments functioning and safe during a pandemic. So the grants really spanned 4 core buckets of expenses: ensuring that safe and efficient election day administration, expanding voter education and outreach efforts, launching poll worker recruitment, training, and safety efforts, as we've heard a bit about already, and then also, of course, supporting early voting and in-person, both in-person and vote by mail. We definitely know that not all election offices are alike. They vary in size, geography, policy, all of those things. And so we really wanted to keep the grant program grounded in that and not be overly prescriptive with the sort of things that we asked election departments to do with it. And so we really gave local offices as much discretion as possible to use the funds in the areas that they specifically saw as their highest need. And we also knew that election departments, of course, had more on their plates than maybe they've ever had before in their careers. And so we really sort of took a election official centric design approach to creating the actual process itself, even though we did it in a really short amount of time. So some of those specific things, it took no more than 45 minutes in total to complete the application, including gathering the materials that it would be required to submit to us. We've created a final report that takes no more than 15 minutes to complete, and it's not due until the end of January 2021, recognizing that it might be challenging to complete a narrative report and return it at the end of December. And as you mentioned, it was backed by nearly $400 million in philanthropic funding, with $350 million coming in September and October from Dr. Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg. All told, we received applications and provided grant awards to over 2,500 election departments. If you could put up the slide, those election departments came from 49 states. So by January, our little nonprofit here in the Midwest will have given away nearly as much funding as the federal government. In terms of the different types of expenses that we saw from election departments, they were vast and they were varied, much as our election departments are. Over 500 election offices invested some of their grant money in nonpartisan voter education to help voters understand their options and really focus on increasing confidence in the process. Thousands more hired poll workers or were able to offer hazard pay plus the necessary PPE. Over 1,500 election departments spent money on temporary staffing and equipment and supplies for mail or absentee ballots. We released a preliminary report that we'll link to, and feel free to take down the slide, where you can read about the folding machines and the inserters and the letter openers and the generators and the poll books and the thermometers and the storage bins and the shelving and the seats and the drop boxes and the signage and the chairs and the ramps and the sidewalks. Like literally sidewalks were put in to make things more accessible. The walls that were taken down to increase the space for social distancing, all that were funded by these grant funds. And it, I think, kind of goes without saying, I'm really deeply, deeply, deeply proud of this work, but it was a massive public policy failure, frankly, that it was required in a time when our democracy really needed leadership more than ever. So from my perspective, looking forward, I think a few things. We absolutely need predictable, sustained funding for elections that is public funding. While there might be seasonal peaks, this is year-round every year work, and funding needs to reflect that reality. And funding also has to reflect the increased complexity of the work of election administrators, the ways that technology has increased the demands on election officials and required more and more specialization, whether it is in cybersecurity, data in general, using social media. This is, critical for voters. It's critical for election officials to be set up for success. And I think that the last thing that I really want to lift up before handing it back is that sometimes I think we forget that elections are people powered. Election departments are made up of the people that are the folks that are on this panel right now. One of the most common pieces of feedback that I got this election cycle was the ways that this grant funding helped to improve the mental health of election officials. In the middle of one of the most challenging moments in our democracy that intersected with a public health crisis, elected leaders basically left election officials to just figure it out. So these grants meant that election officials who hadn't seen weekends in months were able to get a few more hours of sleep and far less paper cuts because they could afford letter openers. It meant tiers for some election officials who were able to finally afford to provide hazard pay for their staff. It meant being able to rent a warehouse large enough to provide social distance while processing ballots to ease concerns of losing another staff member to coronavirus. These were the realities that I was hearing every day in conversations with election officials. There were times where we had to, step away from calls, hold it together on those calls, and where I literally cried afterwards because of what our country's election officials were up against. So when we don't adequately fund our elections, we are of course doing our democracy a disservice, but we're also letting down, voters and burdening election officials in a way that I find unconscionable. And so I think that this is also a values conversation.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that you weren't looking for this role to be having your organization give money away. I think if Congress had given to the states anything close to the $2 to $4 billion that had been suggested earlier in this year, we all would have been a lot happier with the results. I do think that the concerns that you bring into this situation, from having seen election officials struggle with very emotional moments, very personal moments, seeing election officials quarantine or sadly pass away due to this virus, and because there is no ability to do elections remotely in a meaningful way, really does raise the public policy crisis connected to the lack of federal funding and support from elections, or lack of state election funding in moments of crisis. I'd love to turn to the secretary and to the chair and just sort of say, I know it's difficult at times to pose policy solutions to Congress and or your state legislatures. How do we get out of this mess, especially in moments of crisis?
Well, I think right now, any conversation about elections is so just marred by partisanship, and that is really unfortunate. In Arizona, my administration was hampered by that partisanship because the federal dollars that come to Arizona for elections require legislative appropriation. And when the CARES Act was passed, and we got $9 million, our legislature, which was still in session at the time, decided to leave that money on the table. They weren't going to give it to us. And what ended up happening was we worked with the governor's office, who is a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and he gave us the money out of his pile of CARES Act money. So we were very fortunate to be able to implement our plan for safe and secure elections in the pandemic. But there was still sticking points with that. And we had a robust public education plan. And the legislature was upset about it because they thought I was going to plaster my face all over billboards and TV ads, which wasn't what we were going to do at all. And so the governor bought into that. And so then we weren't going to get the money for that. And that public education campaign was a critical component of making sure that voters could vote safely and that this election was successful. And so the private dollars that came in for that, that's what we utilized our grant for, was that public education campaign. And it was hugely successful. But we would have, I mean, voters would have been the ones who were left out if we didn't have those funds. And so I think that the bottom line for me is that we have to take the partisanship out of this whole equation, if that's even possible, and just really election funding needs to be predictable and stable. I don't know what we would have done without that private grant to implement our public education campaign.
I'd echo a lot of what Secretary Hobbs said on a couple things. Number one, when you talk to election administrators across the country, the people that actually run elections, Democrat, Republican, Independent, people who have done the job agree on the vast majority of how elections are administered, because it's about good governance and customer service. It's not about politics. And I think how we react in an emergency situation like this year, so much of that is dictated by what our baseline is. And clearly, we have failed to adequately fund elections in normal years, which makes the leap that you have to do in an emergency situation so much higher. We heard Secretary Hobbs say this, Secretary Toulouse Oliver. I've heard from election officials for a number of years about the importance of having an annual consistent federal funding stream. You can look in critical infrastructure at the election subsector specific plan. It talks about how you can't even assess the real risk factors in elections without acknowledging the chronic underfunding that we have elections in this country. I think after the Help America Vote Act, when it originally passed, there was obviously over $3 billion. We had a nationwide replacement of election equipment. And what we saw about a decade later was the beginning of a game of chicken about whether or not there would be federal funding or if the states were going to fulfill their traditional role. What I think we've seen since 2016 in the conversation, and again, that critical infrastructure subsector plan talks about a whole of government approach to funding elections. Yes, state and local election officials are primarily responsible for running elections and primarily responsible for funding elections, but this is a national security issue and there's a federal piece. And if there's an annual funding stream, if there's a way to do that, you can then say this is the federal part. People can plan for that. State legislatures, local legislatures can know what the federal piece of the money is. And again, we think about what this looks like up and down the scale. Certainly at the EAC in 2019, we had our lowest funding ever. We were at $7.95 million for an operating budget as a federal agency. Earlier this year, we were down to 18 people in a federal agency. We did get a slight bump, but we were still if you adjust for inflation, we were at 68% this year of what we would have been in 2010, before Russian interference, before a pandemic. We asked for supplemental funding and didn't get any. Last year, I testified in front of Congress and talked about how Kansas City, Missouri spends more to fill potholes than we get at the EAC as our annual budget. And I say that, and I say it again now, because investing in our elections, that is the infrastructure of our democracy. This year, with people losing faith in the process, with all the challenges we face, if this isn't a wake-up call that we have to start investing in our democracy appropriately, I don't know what is. And really, again, we can figure out a whole of government approach to it. It's federal money, it's state money, it's local money, but we need to figure that out.
I'd like to turn to the question of state versus local, actually. And this was raised a little bit just by the dynamic of the different ways that funding is given. Most of the federal dollars have been done through the Help America Vote Act process, where it goes to the state, and you see the challenges sometimes of that happening that Secretary Hobbs just raised, of a state legislature, engaging in maybe a little gamesmanship around the use of that funding or not. We also saw that in Minnesota related to cybersecurity funding, where the Secretary of State wanted to use it to help protect their elections, but there were some problems and holdups within the Minnesota legislature. the interesting thing about the Ctcl grants was that local election officials themselves could request it. They could ask for it. They could focus on what they actually needed. And that's a different way of identifying and receiving funds for urgent local needs. And so I'd love to turn it to our good local election officials in Michigan and Pennsylvania to really sort of say, how does both either the grant work really help you identify the needs that you have at the local level, and what more or what other models might you want to see to grow your funding from either your county or city, the state, or the federal government?
Well, I rather liked working with CTCL. The process was easy. It was very organized, and politics didn't get in the way. We could use the money as we needed. In Detroit, we bought a lot of equipment, a lot of mail sorters and high-speed scanners and the like. We were able to hire nurses or medical assistants, which was necessary for us so that our poll workers can feel safe. And the one thing that I think this grant did for us, other than to help us to purchase those things, it allowed, I think, other government agencies, the state, federal, to see how underfunded elections really are. And that if we are to continue to work in a spirit of excellency, we're nonpartisan in Detroit. I'm a nonpartisan clerk. Elections is a nonpartisan entity. At the end of the day, our charge is to administer good, fair elections. And we only can do that with a budget, right? We have to pay staff. We have to have equipment. We have to move with the times. And when we can't and we aren't able to, it shows in the election process.
Thank you. Commissioner Pipe?
Thank you. I would say similarly, the ability for us to forge partnerships with other nonprofits and other entities that provide pro bono services. For example, in Center County, we had a great collaboration with the United States Digital Response, or USDR for short, in addition to the CTCL. The USDR enabled us to create a scheduling platform that enabled our residents who are interested in early voting to schedule a time when they would come into the satellite elections office to cast their early vote. Due to the pandemic, we needed to prepare for social distancing, allow space for individuals to come in and vote. They also enabled us to have an online form where they could fill out their absentee or mail-in ballot application, make sure that we have all of the information in that PDF, print it out, sign it, and they would bring it in to request their ballot. So the USDR, CTCL, great organizations that were able to get county governments and get city governments running elections the ability to offset costs. We actually did we were about to do an RFP for the scheduling platform for individuals interested in early voting. And we got some unofficial quotes back that were in the five figures, $20,000, $30,000. USDR comes in and is able to do it for nothing. I mean, we needed to pay a few dollars that came out of the Ctcl grant for buying these very relatively low cost website and platforms that we were able to utilize. And the argument then in the other roles that county government and other local governments play is we can use those same websites, forms, and techniques we found very helpful to engage with our citizens and our voters for elections in other ways as well, for human services, corrections, transportation services, mental health. So elections is not only an ability to make sure that we have a strong democracy, it's also a way that we can make sure we have strong local governments. And I think that continued conversation as we go into next year, I joke with our staff here that polls open in about 160 days in Pennsylvania. So we have another election coming up. What can we do to make sure 2021 is an even more robust, open, and free election than we had just a few months ago?
Thank you both so much. We only have a couple of minutes left. You know, in reflecting on the challenges of this election cycle, you know, I had a conversation with someone in DC in March, you know, about the needs, and there was a response at that time, and it was early in the pandemic. Well, you know, election officials might need a little PPE, but I'm not hearing a big need. And, you know, hearing hearing our clerk refer to hiring nurses to help our election, our volunteers feel safe, to be able to, buy plexiglass barriers to ensure that folks are taken care of, public information campaigns. All of these things, they cost money. And I don't think that even as the pandemic starts to wane, that it will be the end of urgent needs connected to elections. Do we need a campaign for election funding in this country? And I know almost all of you are governmental officials, tough to call for campaigns, even if they're nonpartisan, but what would it look like to pull together a major push to fund elections at the scale of which they are necessary? Anyone?
I'll go as a non-elected official. Yes, I think that there should be a campaign for robust public funding for elections. I think that any work that is focused on election law reform or voting reform should have paired with it an implementation plan. And there's no implementation plan that's complete without a budget for election departments to actually make those laws work in practice. So I think that any work that's focused on improving election laws should have built into them a vision for how to also make sure that election officials have the funds that they need to implement those effectively. And implicit in that is that there has to be budget campaigns as a part of it.
Other thoughts in the last few moments?
Yeah, also, in addition to what Tiana said, an education piece has to be a part of any campaign or any plan to increase our dollars. People just don't know what we do. They don't know how people-driven it is. They don't know how technical it is. And they don't know that it affects, to administer election affects every aspect of that community if it's done correctly. So an education piece is definitely necessary, an important component of any campaign to increase election dollars.
Thank you so much, all of these great panelists. This has been a surprisingly emotional conversation connected to election funding, and this has been a really tough year for election officials, some surprising costs, some surprising needs, and all of you have been performing well and above and beyond what anyone expected of the election official community, and are just heroes in my book. I want to thank you all for being part of this great panel and for all of the work that you do. With that, I'd like to turn it over to BPC to go into the next break.